So he then began his race work, as I have. And eventually he'd go to Harvard and he'd finish his thesis there. A work still worth reading. The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States. It was published in a Harvard series of books by students. 1903, he would publish a little work that should be the purpose of understanding Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks. I just read that about 3 months ago. Not criticizing Washington, but taking some exception to some of the things Washington had done. I mean, you should get the book. You can read it in less than an evening. And read Souls of Black Folks. Don't take my word for it. I want you to check me out. I want you to try to find me wrong because I know you can't do it. And read his gift to black folks. 1915. Read his classic essay, Africa and the War. And read his little book called The Negro, a general survey of African people in the world, doing exceptionally well when fortunate enough not to be interfered with by foreigners. It gives you a picture of African people functioning in a global situation, while the basic headquarters of African people throughout the world is Africa itself. So long as we are shy about identifying with Africa, we are going to have a problem that is not going to be solved. Italians never shy away from identifying with Italy. Germans are not shy about identifying with Germany. The word German American is not, it's not any harder to say than African American. You can say that, your tongue don't fall out. But now you want to abbreviate it, Afro-American. There is no fro. Coward. Therefore, Afrocentricity is a personal, meaningless exercise. If it's going to have any meaning at all, it must be called African centricity or African consciousness. And if it's called African centricity, it has to broaden its base. It must include the great 19th century radicals. It must include a good analysis of the man who's been called the father of black nationalism, Martin Delany. It must include an analysis of his work, The Condition and Elevation of the Colored Race. It must include his work on the history of the concept of race and how it developed. It must include Frederick Douglass. It must include Frederick Douglass with some kind of honesty. It's ridiculous, but too often the whole women's lib movement want to dismiss Douglass because he wasn't exactly as kind to his African wife as he should have been. All right, I'm sympathetic towards his African wife. But that doesn't change one iota of Douglass's course, the clarity of his analysis, or the program of the fight that he left for us and his great legacy. The music of Mozart is no less sweet and melodious because he beat his European wife, although in another life I could be sympathetic towards his European wife. I don't see why any man should beat any woman when he can vote with his feet and walk away. It makes no sense to me. But if you're going to go into that 19th century, you've got to deal with this awakening of African consciousness. William Wells Brown, our first novelist, his book about Ethiopia, and we got to do an analysis of George Washington Williams' 2-volume history of Black America and how he handled the African question and brought up the question of the denomination of the word Negro. And Lefty Asante has made a contribution to our consciousness and our direction, but he's barely started. And he's neglected too many monumental figures in our history and too many monumental contributors to our history. Our argument started in the 19th century at the Pan-African Congress. Let me conclude this before the Baptist preacher in me gets the best of me and I talk forever. We went wrong when we failed to understand, of all the Pan-African Congresses, the most significant one was the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, 1945, convened by Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, Nzimwe, and Jomo Kenyatta. Because that is the Congress that planned the independent explosion of Africa. While other Congresses were begging for the right for the African to have the kind of education that would equip them to rule themselves, in 1945, these Congolese said, "We are ready now. We are ready to rule ourselves now. We want freedom, independence, and liberation now." And Kwame Nkrumah was brought home and became head of the pre-colonial government of Ghana and eventually head of state of Ghana. And this frightened the hell out of the European colonial powers, including America. Because if Africans became head of their country, started controlling their own wealth, we would close down Western industry. So they had to stop this in a hurry. So America and the European powers of Europe began to overthrow government after government till they finally overthrew Nkrumah. They had already killed Lumumba. And sooner or later, the Pan-Africans from the north and NASA would be gone. Mandela would be imprisoned. Now we're at the crossroads, debating again direction, debating someone else's ism, forgetting something, that Europeans, irrespective of religious belief, irrespective of political belief, their main interest in Africa is to control Africa. They have no other mission, and the left wants to control Africa as much as the right. So we need not get into these games played in the name of political opportunists and Johnny-come-latelys like Marx and Lenin. They too were playing a European game, a game of European control. They not only didn't know anything about the cultures and politics and the people of Africa, they didn't know what they needed to know about the people of Europe. Otherwise, Russia wouldn't have gone to war with some of its own colleagues had she recognized the cultural differences and the religious differences of these colonies. Those people were willing to stay within the Russian Ovik, but they weren't willing for anybody to dictate everything to them and use their resources at the same time.